Our psalm reading today is a very familiar one to us all, I'm sure, as the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Our first scripture reading this morning is taken from the first book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 20 to 34. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms, from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowls. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipshah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, all of them under their vines and fig trees. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those officials supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. They also brought to the required place barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding, as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, children of Mahal. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in the Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Our second scripture reading is also taken from the first book of Kings, but this time it's chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. Among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not completely follow the Lord as his father David had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chernosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who offered incense and sacrificed to their gods. Then the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Today we're continuing through the program called The Story. We're looking at what God has in store for us at the upper story level. Today we find ourselves in chapter 13 with the king who had it all. King Solomon, easily the most successful king there ever was in worldly terms. At least as some know from last week, it was supposed to be chapter 12 about the kingship of David, but Bruce decided to cover the wonderful story of the wise men in Epiphany instead. It was also about kings that were wise. As we begin now into the second part of 3 parts, really, in the 31 chapter time of the story, we were going to show a video today to do the recap, but we won't do that. So we're going to just skip right into chapter 13. And as we do begin into chapter 13, I'm going to talk about frogs. Who likes frogs? Good? I remember as a kid loving playing with frogs. Frogs are a lot of fun. Perhaps you're most familiar with the illustration about frogs from biology class. Who took biology class? Okay, now frogs are a lot of fun. You can do all kinds of neat things with frogs. So here's the illustration. You have a pot of boiling hot water, and you know what happens when you put a frog in the hot water? What do you think is going to happen? It croaks. Good one, Jeannie. Good one. If you put a frog into lukewarm water, nothing will happen. The frog will just sit there and enjoy the warm water. But if you put it into boiling hot water, it jumps out. It has this innate sense that it knows that, hey, I'm in hot water and I need to get out quickly. So that is the illustration. You keep turning up the heat with a lukewarm frog in it. The frog doesn't know any difference. It eventually gets cooked, and then you have something delicious to eat that tastes something like chicken, I'm told. So what does this mean? It tells us that frogs can detect sudden changes in their environment, but they cannot tell those incremental temperature changes. But by the time they recognize it's a dangerous situation, it is too late and dinner is on the table. Their bodies are too weak to get out of the pot. And why do I give you this analogy? Well, the story of Solomon, the king who had it all, is a bit like that story. And when I think about how rich King Solomon was, I think about some of the superstars that we have today, like Miley Cyrus, or Justin Bieber, or Lindsay Lohan, or Charlie Sheen. Really incredibly popular people in pop culture that had it all. They could afford to buy anything they want. But after a while, you realize that the heat gets temperature up a little bit and more, and then the media captures them, and then they crash, and then they fall and they get into trouble. Solomon starts off strong, like a frog. He jumps over lily pads like no other frog before him. He's got royal frog blood in him, and he is the son of a great king by the name of King David. Any princess would consider it the privilege to kiss his frogness. And as we'll see, 700 princesses come to the altar to marry King Solomon. He was a strong frog, but one day he jumps into a pot of lukewarm water. And slowly it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and Solomon gets cooked. Solomon's life started out great. The son of a great king, King David and Queen Bathsheba. Under David's reign, the land in Israel was running really well. The first time really in the history of Israel that the kingdom has been running smoothly and without conflict and disarray, and there was peace in the land. The upper story has come true to plan as God had intended it, that the people of Israel would be blessed and that they would be in the promised land. Well, under King David's leadership, things were going great. But after a few generations, the people of Israel eventually wanted a king to lead them. So if you think back towards the time of Abraham, when he was called to be the great father of many nations, and then later on there was King Saul, and things weren't going so well, and then the people of Israel said, hey, we want a human king to lead us because God is not all where it's at. we really need somebody human to be a king over us. So after a few generations of challenges, King Saul was there to lead them, eventually led to King David. And David had great prosperity, and now that David has passes on the torch to King Solomon, who would continue on the legacy of being a great king. But David, if you go back to the last chapter, was anointed king at only 16 years of age. And when time passed, he became very old. And the time had come to pass on the torch of the kingship to his son Solomon. And Solomon starts off going very well. Solomon starts off strong. And if you look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5, the God comes to Solomon personally and tells Solomon, you can ask for anything you want, and I will give it to you. No boundaries. Imagine God coming to you and say, what do you want? You can have anything you want. And think about being truthful. What would that be? Like if God came to you in your sleep one night, said, you can have anything you want, what would that possibly be? So what would you like? Any wish. What would your best wish be that you'd want? Questions, audience participation. What do you think? Peace. Good health. Better weather, of course. We live in Canada. Okay? So we could ask for all kinds of things like a long life or better health or maybe wealth. Maybe you need more. Maybe you like to win the lottery or have power or have a nice car or in King Solomon's case, a 3-hump camel. Surprisingly, Solomon does something extraordinary and he asks for wisdom. None of you said wisdom. Maybe you're all wise already. I don't know. But not wisdom for its own sake, because wisdom so that he could know how to discern the right things from right and wrong and to lead the kingdom according to God's desires. So he asked God for wisdom. And God was super impressed with what Solomon asked for, so he implants that wisdom into Solomon's mind. But then God gives one step further and tells Solomon that since you asked for wisdom, I will also give you wealth and honor. Wow, so Solomon really is the king who has it all. And in 1 Kings 3, verse 16, or page 145 in the story, we see wisdom at work. Now, if you read your copy of the story this week for chapter 13, you might recall the story of two women, two prostitutes who came to Solomon claiming that the baby is theirs. Now, one of them, they had their baby die, and the other one lived, and both women said, that's my baby, and I want it. So how does Solomon deal with this conflict? Wisdom kicks in, and he tells his men to cut the baby in half. Imagine that. Wow, I couldn't at all. And cut the baby in half, and give the one alleged mother and the one half, and give the other alleged mother the other half. Well, the first alleged mother says, this is fair, give half to each. And the other mother says, no, give the other woman the baby because she wants to preserve the life of this child. So, of course, hearing this play out, Solomon concludes that it is in the heart of the true mother that he gives the baby to her. It's a beautiful story, but please don't try this at home. It's not a good idea. I know it's certainly happened in my household sometimes when the girls are squabbling and fighting over a toy and they're about to rip it in half. And finally I said, fine, you want it? I'll rip it in half and I'll give you each a half. And finally the one who really wanted it, they relented and said, yes, it's Sarah's. So Solomon not only exercised wisdom, but he also wrote down wisdom in the Proverbs. So if you look through the Bible, there's a book called Proverbs, and there's about 3,000 proverbs that are contained within that book. And there really are pithy little sayings of wise ideas, things that we can apply and live our lives by if we really get into it. But on top of the Proverbs of Solomon, he also wrote Ecclesiastes, and he wrote the Song of Solomon, all of which is a very poetic piece of writing within the Bible. Solomon truly was a great writer. In particular, in the book of Proverbs, he gave us these pithy, short little statements filled with great wisdom. And interestingly, in his writing, Solomon identified all the lukewarm pots that we should avoid, because if you don't, you might get cooked. So if you looked in the story in pages 146 to 150, there's different selections of proverbs contained within it. And here's are some of the favorites that have come to mind. The first one is, better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and nagging wife. Love that one, eh? Good, love that one. Sluggards do not plow in season. Now that's a lukewarm pot. A sluggard who doesn't plow at the appropriate time reaches the boiling point. So at harvest time, they look but find nothing. They get cooked. Food gained by fraud tastes sweet. Now that's a lukewarm pot. But when you gain food from being dishonest, initially it tastes sweet, but you look at the end result and you end up with a mouthful of gravel. This is in the Proverbs. Gossip betrays confidence, and that's the cooking part. And this is the reverse of the others. You've talked too much in the line, you've ended up being damaged in the relationship and the friendships you have, and there again, you're into a lukewarm pot. So avoid talking with people who talk too much. You can get yourself into trouble. And the last one, those who shut their ears to hear the cries of the poor. Now that is a lukewarm pot. Hearing the cry and ignoring it, and also cry out and not be answered. You'll be cooked as well. So Solomon in the Proverbs identifies a number of lukewarm pots. See how our froggy's doing? Oh, he's still cooking there. He's a great king, a great wise king, and into his 4th year of kingship, he uses the many riches that he's been blessed with to build a temple. So you might have heard of the phrase Solomon's temple as a place to go to and worship. So he follows God's plan as laid out. And all the instructions are all written in the scriptures of how exactly the temple is to be built, with all its grand place and gold leaf and marble throughout. Ornate statues abound. Now, if you look to pages 155, 156 in the story, Solomon's popularity is growing. He's like a rock star 3,000 years ago. Perhaps his name is Justin Bieber. I don't know. But people from everywhere are coming to see him and to learn from Solomon, because he was the wisest king they had ever heard of. So the Queen of Sheba comes and brings his gifts, and she's mesmerized by his wisdom. He is the king who had it all, that everybody wanted to adore and to come and be part of his life. But toward the end of his life, and after 40 years of being king, in the end, he got himself cooked after being in that lukewarm water for years and years. And like many others in the Bible, he starts off strong, but finishes poorly. Somewhere along the way, he jumped into the lukewarm pot of water, but he didn't realize that the temperature was getting warmer and hotter, and eventually getting himself cooked. And here's how he gets cooked. If you read toward the reading in 1 Kings 11 that Al read, the lukewarm pot of water is. King Solomon loved many foreign women, beside Pharaoh's daughter, who was his first wife, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. And they were from nations which about the Lord had told the Israelites. You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after other gods. And it goes on and on and on, and eventually he marries 700 people. I can't even imagine, like more than one, but 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now that was quite a mighty king. Yeah, exactly. I could just picture it. Solomon jumped into that lukewarm pot of water, which he knew not to jump into, and yet he did it anyway. And sometimes there's things in our life that we know we shouldn't do, we know we shouldn't go there, and yet we do it anyway, not thinking clearly. Well, that's what Solomon did. He jumped in like anyone else would, Just like people who may win the Mega Millions lottery. They get greedy and they fixated on serving their own desires, that they neglect the needs of others around them who could benefit from that. Solomon was attracted to the wealth, and all the wisdom he had wasn't enough to keep him away from those earthly desires that he had. Solomon was in the pot, and slowly it grew hotter and hotter and hotter as he grew older. So the application of this message is pretty easy, really. We don't want anybody in this room to get cooked like a frog, do we? We don't want to jump into that hot water. We don't want to wake up one day and say, I want to ruin my life and jump into hot water. But no, we want to stay on the even keel, and we want to protect ourselves and stay in the straight and narrow and live according to God's plan for us. For those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, we not only want to keep out of the lukewarm pots for our own sake, but for the sake of others and the family around us. Because when we get into hot water, others are affected by that also. Oftentimes, when we get into that pot of hot water, it not only affects our lives, but it affects the family, our spouses, our children, the people that we work with, and that sort of thing. We want to stay and avoid away from that. So to close, I want to give you a couple of simple, practical steps to avoid jumping into that pot. The first, we want to desire to finish strong. We want to end our life with a legacy that's something to be honorable. We should wake up each morning thanking God for life, praying to God that as you move through the day, that you will finish the day well, and you will be a benefit to others around you and in your relationship with God. The second thing you want to ask God for wisdom. That's what Solomon did. He said to God, I want wisdom. Exactly. So oftentimes if we're in a meeting or we're in a difficult situation, we want to put our heads down in prayer and ask God for help, and that God will grant us wisdom to give us the answers that we need in life. So we're not in it alone, but rather God is there with us, and God reminds us of that each and every day. And the third piece of advice is that to be in a community, don't try to be a lone ranger in life. Be inviting of people into your life and to be accountable to one another. You might have a group of friends. You might have a small group that you want to be part of. You might have family members, people that you can be accountable to keep you out of that hot water, to keep you going that straight and narrow road that is the way that God had intended you to go on. Because if we go out on our own and make our own decisions without consulting others, without having somebody to bounce our thoughts off, we can end up in hot water in the way that Solomon did. So as we go out of this place, we are reminded that God is with us, no matter where we are, and that God gives us the wisdom if we ask for it. King Solomon was the king who had it all, and we can learn a life lesson from the way that he conducted his life and lived his time as king in the people of Israel. Thanks be to God. Amen.